My dad said. Get something cheap for your kids, we're not covering them. While my sister's children were served $80 seafood platters with sparklers. My son stared at a menu he couldn't touch. I simply said, got it. When the waiter came back to close the check, I pushed my chair back and said, my dad leaned in early and told me to make sure I ordered something inexpensive for my kids because, as he put it flatly, they weren't paying for them. Not long after that, my sister Laura's kids were treated to $80 seafood platters that arrived with little sparkler candles blazing, while my own boy stared down at a menu he knew he wasn't really allowed to choose from, and all I could bring myself to say was, noted. The place itself was one of those high-end seafood restaurants where the hostess wears pearls like it's part of the uniform, and the carpet feels so soft it's like stepping on clouds. Oceanside Grill sat right on the water, and my parents had picked it specifically to celebrate Laura's newest promotion. The reservation was for 7:30 on a Saturday night, prime time, with the sun setting over the harbor and glowing through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I showed up with my son Jake, who was 8, holding a homemade congratulations card he'd spent 2 solid hours decorating with markers and stickers, proud as could be. My 5-year-old daughter Lily walked beside me, gripping my hand, wearing her favorite pink dress, the one she only saved for moments she knew were supposed to be special. Laura was already seated when we reached the table, sitting between her husband Ben and their 2 kids, Tyler and Emma. Tyler was 10 and Emma was 7, and both of them had iPads propped up in front of them like the fancy surroundings didn't apply to them. My mom Elaine sat at one end of the long table, and my dad Frank sat at the other, leaving 3 open seats along the side facing the water that were clearly meant for me and my kids. There she is, my dad announced when he saw us coming, and he didn't bother standing up. My mom offered a small wave. Laura smiled, but it was that tight, practiced smile she'd perfected over the years, the one that never quite reached her eyes when I was involved. Jake handed her the card, and she accepted it with 2 fingers, like it might be dirty. Oh, how sweet, thank you, Jake, she said, then set it down on the empty chair beside her without even opening it. The waiter showed up right away, the kind of guy who could spot big spenders from across the room, carrying himself with that smooth confidence you only get from working where appetizers cost more than some people's weekly groceries. He greeted us and asked about drinks, and my dad ordered a scotch while my mom asked for white wine. Laura and Ben both requested elaborate craft cocktails with long explanations involving muddled herbs and specialty spirits. I asked for water with lemon for myself and apple juice for the kids, but my dad cut in, looking at the waiter while motioning toward Jake and Lily, and said water was fine for them and there was no need for juice. The waiter hesitated and glanced at me, and I told him firmly that apple juice was fine. My dad's jaw tightened, but he didn't push it in front of the staff, and the waiter nodded and walked off. My mom asked how traffic was, throwing the question out to the table instead of to me directly, and I said it was fine and mentioned we'd left early to be on time. Laura chimed in that they'd come straight from the country club and that Ben had just finished a round with some clients, casually dropping that he shot a 74. My dad immediately praised him, clearly impressed, while Ben leaned back with the relaxed confidence of someone who had never questioned his place in the world and added that it would have been better if the greens hadn't been tricky on the back 9. I'd heard this routine before, the country club name-dropping, the golf scores, the subtle reminders about who at the table was considered successful. Jake sat quietly next to me, swinging his legs under the chair, while Lily stared out at the boats bobbing in the harbor. When the waiter returned with the drinks, he handed them out smoothly, setting the apple juices down last in front of my kids. That's when my dad spoke up again, saying we should probably sort out the bill before ordering, like he was commenting on the weather. The table went silent and even Tyler and Emma looked up from their screens. My dad explained that he and my mom were covering dinner for Laura and Ben and their kids since it was a celebration. Then he looked straight at me and told me to order something cheap for my kids because they weren't covering them. The words hit hard, and I could see the discomfort ripple around the table. My mom suddenly found her wine glass fascinating. Laura buried her face in the menu, and Ben smirked. Jake's face flushed red, and even at 8 years old, he understood exactly what had just been said. Lily didn't grasp all of it, but she felt the shift and slid her hand into mine under the table. I told them we'd handle our own bill, keeping my voice steady even though my chest was tight with anger. My dad said good and claimed he just wanted everything clear so there'd be no confusion later. The waiter had wisely disappeared during the exchange, but when he came back, my dad was ready. He ordered twin lobster tails for Tyler and Emma and added king crab legs for them to share. And the waiter praised the choice while scribbling it down. Laura added truffle mac and cheese on the side, saying both kids loved it, and Tyler nodded eagerly while Emma was already back on her iPad. My dad ordered a porterhouse steak, my mom chose chili-crusted sea bass, and Laura and Ben both went for massive seafood towers. Everything pulled from the expensive side of the menu where prices climbed into the triple digits. When the waiter finally turned to me, I opened my menu for the first time, and Jake sat beside me without touching his, just like my dad had silently instructed. I quickly scanned the options and did the math in my head, noting that the kids' menu had simple things like grilled cheese, chicken fingers, and buttered pasta all under $15. I ordered grilled cheese for Jake, chicken fingers for Lily, and a house salad for myself. The waiter wrote it down without saying a word, but I caught the brief change in his expression, like he understood more than he let on. I could tell the waiter had seen this kind of thing before, families where some people ate like royalty while others were expected to scrape by, because his eyes lingered just a second longer than necessary. My mom asked if I really didn't want anything from the main menu, and I couldn't tell if her voice carried real concern or just a layer of guilt she didn't know what to do with. I told her the salad was fine and said I wasn't very hungry, which wasn't true at all, since I'd skipped lunch on purpose knowing we were supposed to be having a good dinner, though apparently that came with strings attached. From there, the night unfolded exactly the way you'd expect. The king crab legs showed up first, stacked high on a silver platter with little bowls of melted butter and bright lemon wedges, and Tyler and Emma went after them like kids who'd never once been told to hold back. Jake and Lily watched quietly while their cousins cracked shells and dunked sweet white meat into butter that probably cost more per ounce than hamburger. Ben asked me how work was going, but his tone made it clear he didn't actually care. I told him I was busy and that we just wrapped up a big project rollout. My dad followed up by asking if I was still at that small marketing firm, and when I said yes, he just gave a low hum that somehow communicated everything he thought about my career without saying another word. My mom quickly changed the subject, chirping about Laura's new position and mentioning her corner office on the 30th floor, which Laura corrected to the 28th before agreeing the view was incredible. Ben jumped in to add that the raise was substantial, and that they were now looking at vacation properties in the Bahamas. I smiled and said that sounded wonderful, because there really wasn't any other response available. Jake shifted in his seat, doing his best to stay patient, but he was 8, and the smell of garlic butter and grilled seafood hung heavy in the air, and I knew his stomach had to be growling. When the main dishes arrived, they came out like a show, with towering seafood platters stacked with oysters, shrimp, clams, and lobster, arranged like something meant to be admired before eaten. Tyler and Emma's lobster tails were placed in front of them with sparklers stuck right into the meat, crackling and glittering as the waiter set the plates down. Laura told them to make a wish, and they laughed and waved their hands near the sparks like it was a birthday celebration. Jake's grilled cheese showed up on a plain white plate with a small pile of chips. Lily's chicken fingers looked like they'd come straight from a freezer bag, and my salad was mostly iceberg lettuce with a few limp tomato wedges. My dad commented on how perfect his steak was, and everyone murmured their appreciation for the expensive food in front of them. I watched Jake take tiny bites of his sandwich, chewing slowly to make it last, trying not to stare at Tyler's lobster but failing every few seconds. My mom asked Jake how soccer was going, making an effort, and he quietly told her they'd won their last game and that he'd scored twice, which she acknowledged sweetly before turning right back to Laura's story about her promotion party. The rest of dinner dragged on like that for another 40 minutes, filled with talk about Laura's success, Ben's golf games, private school tuition, and upcoming trips while I said very little, finished my salad, and made sure Jake and Lily ate what they had. When the dessert menus came out, Tyler and Emma both ordered the triple-layer chocolate cake with ice cream without hesitation, $18 a slice. The waiter politely asked Jake and Lily if they wanted to see the dessert menu, but my dad answered for them, saying they were fine and that the check could come whenever, and I saw Jake's face fall for just a split second before he forced it back into something neutral, and that nearly did me in. Watching my 8-year-old teach himself not to react because his grandfather didn't think he was worth a piece of cake was almost more than I could handle. I told the waiter I'd like to see the dessert menu after all, scanned it quickly, and saw that the cheapest thing was a $5 scoop of vanilla ice cream while the most expensive was some flaming bananas thing for $32. I asked Jake and Lily what they wanted, and Jake quietly said they didn't need dessert, trying to make things easier on me, already reading the room like a grown man. I told him I knew we didn't need it, but asked if he wanted it, and Lily immediately said chocolate cake without hesitation, still young enough not to feel ashamed of wanting something. Jake paused and asked if we could afford it, and that question hit me right in the chest. I told him yes, we absolutely could, and asked again what he wanted, and after a small smile crept across his face, he said he wanted the chocolate cake too. I told him then that he'd have it, and I ordered 2 chocolate cakes for the kids and a crème brûlée for myself. My dad raised his eyebrows, and I told him I was just enjoying dessert with my children. When the desserts arrived on another set of fancy plates, Jake and Lily dug in happily, and I cracked the sugar top on my crème brûlée and enjoyed every bite, not because it was incredible, but because every spoonful felt like a quiet act of defiance. Eventually, the waiter returned with the check in a leather folder and placed it carefully in the center of the table, right between my dad and me, like he wasn't sure who would claim it. My dad grabbed it first, flipped it open, and I watched his expression shift as he scanned the receipt. He told the waiter there had been a mistake and pointed out that some items needed to be on a separate bill. The waiter offered to split it however needed, and my dad listed off everything except the grilled cheese, chicken fingers, house salad, and the 3 desserts, saying those belonged elsewhere. That's when I pushed my chair back, stood up, and said I needed to use the restroom. I told myself not to wait around while my dad sorted out the check, grabbed my purse, and headed toward the back of the restaurant where the restrooms were, even though I had no intention of actually using them. Instead, I spotted our waiter near the server station and quietly asked if I could take care of something with the bill before it was finalized, and I could see the relief on his face at not having to deal with my dad. He asked how he could help, and I requested the total for the entire table so far. After checking his tablet, he told me it was $647.32 before tip. I pulled out my credit card and told him I wanted to pay for everything except 3 items, specifically the grilled cheese, the chicken fingers, and the house salad, and that those should stay on a separate check for my father while everything else went on my card. His eyes widened when he repeated back everything else, and I confirmed that I meant all of it: the lobster tails with sparklers, the seafood towers, the steaks, the cocktails, every single celebratory item they'd ordered, because those were the things they wanted to mark Laura's promotion with, and I was happy to consider it my gift to her. He hesitated and reminded me it was over $600, and I told him I understood the math just fine and asked if he could do it. He said yes, just wanted to be sure, and I told him I was completely certain. He ran the card right there, $615.32 before tip, and I added $200 more for him because he'd handled an uncomfortable family situation with patience and had been kind to my kids. The charge went through without a problem, because I had the money I'd been setting aside for months for a spring trip to Disney World with Jake and Lily. That trip would have to wait now, but seeing my father's face when he realized what I'd done was going to be worth every delayed vacation. When I returned to the table, everyone sat in stiff silence, and my dad was still holding the leather billfold, staring down at a receipt that clearly didn't match his expectations. The waiter explained smoothly that there had been an update and that I had taken care of most of the charges, then placed a new billfold in front of my dad and told him his check was just those 3 items. I watched as he opened it and his face flushed red while he read off the line items: grilled cheese $12, chicken fingers $11, house salad $9, subtotal $32. The quiet at the table was thick enough to choke on. Tyler finally looked up from his iPad, sensing the mood shift, while Emma kept scrolling like nothing had happened. Ben's smug expression vanished, replaced by visible discomfort, and Laura's perfectly manicured fingers tapped against the tabletop in a nervous rhythm. My dad's hand shook slightly as he held the tiny receipt, and for someone who always prided himself on being in control and holding the upper hand, this was clearly new ground. He had set the night up to put me and my kids in our place, to remind us where we ranked in the family, and now he was stuck with a $32 bill while I had just dropped more than $800 without blinking. He told me in a low, angry voice that I had no right to do what I did, and I calmly replied that I had every right, that I was an adult spending my own money however I saw fit. He called it absurd and turned to my mom, Elaine, demanding she say something, but she just looked back and forth between us, clutching her wine glass, and admitted she didn't know what he wanted her to say. He told her to tell me I was being irrational, and I asked the table if I was, pointing out that my father had announced in front of my children that they weren't worth including in the celebration, that he'd told me to order them cheap food while their cousins got seafood platters with sparklers, and that all I'd done was decide to cover the celebration myself. Laura jumped in, accusing me of twisting things and saying Dad was just being practical since they were already paying for 6 people, and adding 3 more would have been too much. I asked why, if budget was such a concern, the celebration was held at a restaurant this expensive in the first place, or why we were invited at all if we were just going to be treated like charity cases who should feel lucky for whatever scraps we got. The tension hung in the air, and I could tell other diners were watching even though they pretended not to be, turning our table into dinner entertainment, and I no longer cared. Ben tried to calm things down by saying maybe everyone was overreacting and it was just one dinner, and I agreed that it was one dinner, but it was also 8 years of birthdays where Tyler and Emma got elaborate gifts while Jake got gift cards, Christmas mornings where their pile of presents dwarfed his, constant praise for Laura's success paired with quiet criticism of my life, and 1,000 small slights my kids had noticed even when they couldn't put words to them. My mom weakly said that wasn't fair, and I told her exactly none of it was fair. By then my dad's face had turned nearly purple, and he said he wouldn't sit there and be lectured about fairness, insisting everything he and my mom had done was in the family's best interest. I told him it was in his version of the family, the one where Laura was the star and everyone else played backup. Laura shoved her chair back and stood up, accusing me of always being jealous and trying to ruin her celebration because I couldn't stand her success, and I told her I wasn't jealous, I was disappointed. She froze as I said she had 2 beautiful kids who were learning that some people mattered more than others, that she was passing on the same lessons our parents taught us, and that one day her kids would treat someone else's children the same way she just silently watched hers treat mine. She opened her mouth, then shut it, and finally looked over at Tyler and Emma, still absorbed in their screens, chocolate smeared on Tyler's cheek and Emma's plate reduced to empty lobster shells. "Come on, Ben, we're leaving," Laura said sharply as she grabbed her purse, and Ben hesitated for a second, gesturing awkwardly toward the whole check situation like he wasn't sure what to do. I told him it was already handled and congratulated Laura again on her promotion, making sure she knew I genuinely meant it. She stared at me for a long moment, something complicated flashing across her face, then she gathered Tyler and Emma and walked out, and the whole thing felt strangely anticlimactic as they disappeared through the door like any other family heading back to their big house with the pool and the home theater, probably already rewriting the night in their heads as proof that I was unstable. My dad finally spoke again, accusing me of destroying the family, and I told him calmly that I hadn't destroyed anything. I just stopped pretending the damage wasn't already there. The silence that followed was heavy as he held up the billfold and demanded to know what this was, and I told him it was his portion, the exact items he'd offered to cover, because everything else had already been taken care of. Laura snapped that I'd paid for all of it, disbelief sharp in her voice, and I confirmed that I had, telling her to consider it a promotion gift and congratulating her again. My mom's hand flew to her throat, Ben looked like he'd swallowed something sour, and Tyler and Emma kept scraping chocolate frosting from their plates, completely unaware. My dad said it was ridiculous and that I couldn't afford something like that, and I replied that apparently I could since my card went through. He said that money should be going toward my kids' college funds or something responsible, and I told him those funds were fine and that he was right about one thing, I should be focusing on my kids. I turned to Jake and Lily and asked if they were ready to go, and they nodded quickly, sliding out of their chairs, while Jake picked up the handmade card he'd made for Laura, which was still sitting unopened on the empty chair. My mom asked if I was really leaving, and I said yes, we were done eating, I'd paid my bill, and there was no reason to stay. Then I looked at my dad and reminded him his check was $32 and that I was sure he could manage it, especially since he'd chosen such a cheap meal. The comparison landed exactly how I wanted, and his face darkened instantly. Laura called me childish and I told her maybe I was, or maybe I was just tired of watching my kids be treated like they didn't matter while hers got sparkler candles stuck in their lobster tails, and either way we were done. I took Jake's hand and Lily's hand and walked out, hearing my dad raise his voice behind me, my mom trying to calm him down, Laura complaining about being embarrassed, and Ben letting out an uncomfortable laugh, but I never turned around. Out in the parking lot, Jake asked if that had been a lot of money, and I told him yes it was, and when he asked if we were in trouble I assured him we were fine. He asked about Disney World and I realized he'd known about the savings all along, so I told him we'd figure it out and maybe go next year. And he surprised me by saying he didn't even need to go because tonight had been better than Disney World since Grandpa was mean and I wasn't scared and I'd been strong. Lily squeezed my hand and told me I'd been like a superhero, and I buckled them into their seats, sat behind the wheel for a moment, and let myself breathe before starting the car. My phone lit up with a call from my dad, which I declined, then another from Laura, which I also declined, followed by a text from my mom asking me to call because we needed to talk, and I turned my phone off completely. The drive home took about 30 minutes, and Jake and Lily talked the whole way about the boats in the harbor, and how cool the sparkler candles had been, their earlier disappointment completely gone. At home, I got them ready for bed, brushed teeth, pajamas on, stories read, and Jake hugged me extra tight and thanked me for the chocolate cake, and then added that making Grandpa's face turn purple had been pretty cool, which made me laugh even though I told him that hadn't been the goal. After they were asleep, I sat on the couch and turned my phone back on to see 23 missed calls and 15 text messages, and I didn't read most of them closely, just enough to get the idea. My dad accusing me of embarrassing the family and being irresponsible with money, Laura saying I'd ruined her celebration and made a scene, my mom begging me to apologize so we could move on because family mattered, and Ben tossing in a sarcastic comment about maturity like his opinion carried any weight. At the bottom was a message from an unknown number, and it turned out to be Patrick, our waiter, telling me he hoped it wasn't inappropriate but that what I'd done had been incredible, that in 15 years of restaurant work he'd never seen anyone handle a situation like that with so much dignity, and that my kids were lucky to have me, with a thank you for the generous tip. I read that message 3 times and saved his number with a smile. The next morning, Sunday, I took Jake and Lily to the park, packed simple sandwiches, and we had a picnic on the grass that cost about $14 total, and felt better than the entire night at Oceanside Grill, sparkler candles and all. While we were feeding ducks by the pond, my mom called again, and this time I answered, telling her hello, and she sounded relieved but said my dad was beside himself because I'd embarrassed him in front of Laura and Ben and the whole restaurant. I told her he'd embarrassed himself and, more importantly, he'd humiliated Jake and Lily by telling me to order cheap food for them while their cousins got lobster tails with candles, and when she said he'd just been trying to help Laura celebrate, I told her he could have done that without making my children feel like they didn't matter at all. Mom, there's a big difference between making one person feel special and making everyone else feel like garbage, I said. And the line went quiet for a few seconds before she finally admitted, softly, that she knew my dad had been harsh. Harsh doesn't even cover it, Mom, I said, because Ryan actually asked me if we could afford dessert, and he's 8 years old and already worrying about money because his grandfather made it painfully clear that he wasn't worth spending on. She asked what I wanted her to say, and I told her exactly that I wanted her to admit it was wrong to say Dad crossed a line and that she wasn't okay with it, though I added that I knew she wouldn't say that because she never does. There was another long pause before she brought up the money, asking if what I spent really had been our Disney World fund, and when I said yes, she told me not to do that, but I explained that I'd made my choice and I was fine with it because my kids needed to see that they mattered and that someone would stand up for them, and if that cost me a vacation, so be it. She told me my father wanted an apology and was talking about cutting me out of the will, which actually made me laugh because I'd never expected anything from his will anyway, not when Laura had been the golden child since we were teenagers. Mom tried to deny it, but I told her we both knew it was true, and that it didn't matter because I didn't need his money and I was doing okay on my own. She questioned that, pointing out that I'd spent my vacation savings on one dinner, and I told her yes, I was doing fine. I had a job, a house we loved, and 2 amazing kids who deserved better than being treated like second-class family. Right then Ryan ran up to me, covered in duck feathers and grinning, asking if we could get ice cream on the way home, and I said yes, which prompted my mom to say she should let me go. I told her to tell Dad hello but that I wasn't apologizing, and when she warned me he'd be angry, I said he'd either get over it or he wouldn't, but either way I was at peace with my decision. After I hung up, I took Jake and Lily for ice cream, and we sat outside the shop watching people walk by, Lily with mint chocolate chips smeared green across her nose and Jake racing the heat to finish his cookie dough before it melted. Between bites, Jake asked if we were poor, and when I asked why, he explained that Grandpa had told us to order cheap food and that I'd spent all our vacation money, so he was just wondering. I told him we weren't poor at all, that we had everything we needed and most of what we wanted, and that families having different amounts of money didn't make anyone better or worse. He mentioned that Tyler had said their house had a pool and a movie theater, then shrugged and said he liked our house better because it felt more like home, and I told him I felt the same way. The week after the dinner passed quietly with no contact from my family, and I went about my normal routine: work, school drop-offs, activities, enjoying the lack of drama more than I expected. On Friday afternoon, my doorbell rang, and when I opened it, my mom stood there holding a plastic container, saying she'd made chocolate chip cookies because they were Jake's favorite, and I let her in. In the kitchen, after an awkward pause, she admitted my dad was still angry, then quickly said she thought what I'd done was brave and that I'd been right to stand up for my kids, adding that she should have spoken up when he told me to order cheap food and that she was sorry she hadn't. Tears caught me off guard, but I thanked her, and she went on to say that while she didn't agree with how I handled it and thought spending that much money was excessive and embarrassing, she understood why I'd been angry and believed I'd had every right to be. It wasn't a full apology, but it was more than I'd ever gotten before, so I accepted it for what it was. When I asked about Laura, she said my sister was furious and convinced I tried to steal the spotlight, and even though I pointed out that I'd paid for her expensive meal, Mom said Laura felt I'd made myself the center of attention, which I could understand even if it hadn't been my intention. She also mentioned Laura was sure I'd never be able to recover financially and would end up asking for help, and I told her she was wrong and that I budgeted carefully. Mom surprised me by agreeing, saying I'd always been more sensible with money than my sister and admitting that Laura and Ben actually spent everything they made and more, stretched thin by their lifestyle even if they hid it well. Before leaving, Mom asked if she could see the kids without my dad present, and I agreed as long as she never again tolerated anyone treating my children as less than, and she promised to try. 3 weeks later, I got a call at work from an unfamiliar number, almost ignored it, but answered at the last second, and the man on the line introduced himself as Coach Stevens from the soccer league, explaining that someone had made an anonymous donation to sponsor Jake for the elite training program and wanted to remain unnamed. He asked if I'd be comfortable with Jake participating, and my mind raced because it was something I'd looked into and ruled out because of the cost. When I asked if he could tell me anything about the donor, he said no, only that the full year had been covered including equipment and travel, and I told him yes, absolutely, and thanked him, then sat at my desk afterward trying to figure out who in the world would have done something like that. It definitely wasn't my parents, and it sure wasn't Laura or Ben, and I ran through my aunts and uncles in my head, but none of them even knew Jake played soccer, let alone that he was good enough for elite training, so the whole thing stayed a mystery until about 2 months later when I ran into Patrick, the waiter from Oceanside Grill at a little coffee shop. He smiled and said hello, recognized me right away, and asked how my kids were doing. And I told him they were great and mentioned that someone had anonymously sponsored my son for an incredible soccer program. I saw his expression change just slightly, like something flickered behind his eyes, and I slowly asked him if he had anything to do with it. He hesitated and said he wasn't supposed to say anything, which told me everything I needed to know, and when I pressed a little, he sighed and admitted it wasn't just him. After that night at the restaurant, he told some of the other servers and kitchen staff what had happened. The story had spread, and a bunch of them had decided to chip in together because they wanted to do something kind for my kid after seeing how he handled such an unfair situation with so much grace. My throat tightened immediately, and I told him he didn't have to do that, but he said they wanted to, explaining that people who work in restaurants see a lot of family dynamics and learn pretty quickly who treats their kids well and who doesn't, and that my kids were lucky to have someone willing to fight for them, so they wanted to fight for them too in their own small way. I hugged him right there in the coffee shop without thinking twice, probably breaking some unspoken social rule, but I didn't care in the slightest. Jake absolutely thrived in the elite training program, growing more confident every week, making new friends, scoring goals, learning advanced techniques, and coming home after practice exhausted and genuinely happy. Lily started kindergarten around the same time and joined the school choir, and our house filled with her nonstop singing, little made-up songs about breakfast cereal, shoes, the sky, and whatever else crossed her mind. Not long after, I earned a promotion at work along with a raise that made rebuilding the Disney World Fund possible within 6 months, and we went ahead and booked the trip for spring break. My relationship with my dad stayed strained, polite but distant, with brief exchanges at holidays and no real warmth, and we never apologized to each other about the restaurant, just existed in separate orbits held loosely together by my mom. Laura and I spoke even less than before, exchanging nothing more than Christmas cards out of obligation, sisters in name only. But my mom and I grew closer, and she started showing up to Jake's soccer games and Lily's choir performances, bringing cookies, snapping photos, cheering loudly, and doing her best to make up for years of silence in the only way she knew how. Almost a year after the night at Oceanside Grill, Mom and I sat together on metal bleachers watching Jake's team play in a fall tournament, the kind of day where the air smells like leaves and possibility, and out of nowhere she told me she was proud of me. I asked what for, genuinely surprised, and she said for raising good kids, for standing up for them, and for being the kind of mother she wished she'd been. I told her she hadn't been a bad mother, and she shook her head and said she hadn't been a brave one, admitting she'd let my father make decisions she didn't agree with, let Laura be favored, and let me feel like second best. She wiped her eyes and said that watching me push back that night at the restaurant made her realize I'd broken a cycle, and that my kids would never grow up wondering if they were loved as much as someone else because they would know. I said my kids were easy to love, and she replied that all children are, and that some parents just forget that. When Jake scored a goal, we both jumped up cheering, and he looked toward the bleachers, spotted us, and waved with a smile full of pure joy, completely untouched by doubt or insecurity about his worth. Later that night, after the house was quiet and the kids were asleep, I found the receipt from Oceanside Grill tucked away in a drawer with old birthday cards and expired coupons, showing $615. $32 for the meal, $200 for the tip, $815. $32 total, an amount that had felt enormous that night and truly had been. But nearly a year later, looking at it again, I couldn't think of a better way I'd ever spent $800 because my kids knew they mattered. They knew someone would stand up for them. They understood that grilled cheese and chicken fingers were sometimes just food but sometimes a line worth drawing, and most importantly, they knew without question that they were worth far more than lobster tails with sparkler candles.